When we look at Roman Britain and we prepare for these kind of things, I know it's normal to talk a little bit about the preamble of what happens, and that's no different today. I want to sit here and talk a little bit about where we're at this point, what's going on, and more importantly, where has Rome been and where is it going before it invades. So that's this episode of the Roman Britain podcast. See you after the break. Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast. Today we explore the army that would eventually march across the Channel and bring much of Britain into the Roman world. Before discussing the battles that shaped Roman power in the province, it's essential to understand what the Roman military was actually doing on the eve of the Claudian invasions. What did these soldiers look like? How were they organized? And what made them so effective in that time period? In this episode, I will walk you through the composition of the early Roman army from the reign of Augustus through to Claudius, and I will describe what the archaeological evidence tells us about their weapons, their armor, and the logistics behind them, which were so effective and so complete in creating what we now know as the Roman military machine. I'll also explain why Rome kept expanding even after it was dominating the Mediterranean, and how its conquest of Gaul illustrates both its strengths and wider imperial strategy, and why it eventually becomes a weakness. By the end, we'll have a clear image of the force that stood ready for the year 43 AD, the force that the kings and tribes of Britain would soon come to know very well. Our title today is Victoria Paratur, which means victory is prepared. It is a phrase connected to the Roman military tradition and appears in the writings of Vigidus in the 4th century, but sentiment can be traced far earlier. It captures the Roman belief that success belongs not to luck or divine favor, but to discipline, preparation, and organization, and it's those principles which shaped the army long before it reached British shores. To understand the army in 43 AD, we need to begin with the reforms of Augustus. After the civil wars, Augustus reorganized the Roman military into a standard professional force instead of temporary legions raised for crises. He created permanent units stationed across the empire, and these legions in the early 1st century each contained about 5,000 heavy infantry. The structure was consistent. 10 cohorts, each divided into centuries commanded by centurions, thus kind of the name, would then basically make up this larger legion. The legion's command hierarchy was known from inscriptions, military diplomas, and the writings of people like Vigidus. Senior officials included the legates and 6 military tribunes, as well as the primus Pullius, who was the most senior centurion. Archaeology supports the scale and infrastructure needed to house such a unit. Legionary fortresses at Mainz, Vindelica, Bonn, and Nijmegen show the same internal layout. Headquarters buildings and granaries, workshops, barrack blocks, and bathhouses all appear, regardless of the location. This, of course, shows a consistency that reflects a standardized military culture shared across the provinces. No matter where you were in the Roman Empire, you knew what a barrack looked like, you knew who was in charge and where to find them, something that would be incredibly important. Service in the legion was long. Augustus set the terms at 16 years, which would later extend, and actual service often lasted longer due to delays and discharges. Salaries were paid from the emperor's treasury, and the veterans received cash settlements funded through a special military fund. In fact, going back even centuries before that, whenever they conquered a new area, one of the first things the Romans did was set up what they called a colony, or colonia, which is where we get the term colony from, wherein the veterans would be settled in the land that was taken as a way, one, to set up a protection, shall we call it, in case it was needed of people who were hard-fought veterans of so many wars, and also that they had with them offered a way of paying them back for the service they gave. So it's kind of a double win for them. Gravestones and discharge diplomas confirm the diverse origins of the legionnaires. While the army had traditionally been an Italian institution, by the early 1st century, recruits increasingly came from the provinces. Spain, Narbonese, Gaul, and North Africa produced large numbers of soldiers. By the Clodian period, a legion was far from a purely Italian force, though officers were still largely drawn from Roman families. You can understand that that would be a point of honor and a way of effectively gaining more financial well-being from conquest, among other things, as well as obviously fame and fortune would follow. Archaeology provides us one of the clearest pictures here of what weapons and armor would look like. Obviously, at sites like Kalkaris in Germany, Haltern on the Lippe, and Corbridge in Britain, hoards and battlefield finds have revealed equipment used by early imperial troops. It is not the same as what we see on TV. It is not the same as what we see in movies. And quite frequently, we have to understand that just because some people had these didn't mean everybody did. The gladius was the primary sword, a short sword that effectively did not have a side in the way we would normally expect. It was just a rounded sword so that when you stabbed, it would effectively be a underarm stabbing. It was not meant to be swung overhead, which is part of the reason why you have it the way it is. And it was used in concert with the shields that they had, which went along with these as kind of the main device. The gladius's design was well evidenced in finds from Mainz and Pompeii. Javelins known as pilla had a long, narrow iron shank designed to penetrate shields and weapons. The pilla's point was to be thrown and embed itself into a shield, thus weighing the shield down to try and force people to drop the shield. That was the goal behind it, because the pilla would bend easily and couldn't be withdrawn with a lot of ease. So you couldn't, set your shield down, pull the pilla out, and, pick it back up again. And you're in the middle of a battle. That doesn't really work terribly well. So, and it makes it more difficult to lift up so that when people are firing arrows at you, you can't lift your shield to protect your head because you've got this great big huge effectively spear stuck in it. So it had kind of a two-ordered method that would work, both to kind of weigh the shield down and to help keep people from protecting themselves with it like they would have normally. Something of a development that was very successful fighting phalanxes and people of that nature. Something that obviously the Romans would develop in all the battles they fought with various, especially Greek groups. Helmets of the Weisenau type were made of iron or bronze with cheek pieces, and of course are known from multiple continental excavations. We're all very familiar what a Roman helmet would look like. Body armor, of course, varied, and this is where I was saying not everybody looked the same. Chainmail at this point was widespread, but by the early imperial period, the segmented armor that we're more familiar with, known as the Iorca segmentata, had been adopted by some legions. The best preserved examples come from the Corbridge Horde, again from Britain, although this represents a slightly later period, obviously. It still gives us a good example, but keep in mind these are expensive at this point, so they're not carried by everybody. Chainmail is the more popular wear at this stage, and the idea of these all metal, heavy, standardized equipment is not quite there yet. It's getting there, but it's not quite there yet, so that's something to keep in mind. Legionaries also carried long, curved, rectangular shields known as scuta, whose construction is evidenced by wooden remains at Dura Europus and by metal fittings found across familiar former legionary sites. Obviously, during burial, these wooden things would rot away, and what we'd be left with is the nails and the pieces of metal. So you could kind of gather from what they did find, plus this kind of how they were built. Of course, what this meant is that the standardization of equipment was one of Rome's strengths. A force equipped essentially in the same way could act cohesively and adapt quickly, maintain its gear using shared workshops. It also allowed for a sense of stability and a sense of unity because you're all wearing the same thing. You all look the same way. It's also very helpful if you're fighting in a bloody and muddled battlefield, if you can tell the difference between you and the other guys. Now, keep in mind, as we talk about all this, there are other military people that are fighting for the Roman military that don't look like this. There are light cavalry. There are assorted other people that are fighting in auxiliary groups that aren't looking like this. But for the main part of the military looks like this. So in that respect, they continue to hold their familiarity, their unity, and their look, making it clear who's who. A full understanding of the imperial military, of course, requires discussing the auxilia. These were non-citizen troops recruited from across the provinces. They made up roughly half of the imperial army by the 40s, and their role was vital. These are the people that I just said didn't look necessarily like a Roman soldier as we picture them would look. Auxiliary regiments were organized into several types. Cohors, equitata, were combined infantry with a small cavalry element. Cohors petidata were infantry-only units. In other words, foot and horse. The alae were pure cavalry units, and some were exceptionally large. The famous ala gallorum numbered amongst 1,000 troopers. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of non-local recruits. Tombstones and altars found in Bonn, Nijmegen, and Vindousia record Syrian archers, Gallic cavalrymen, Thracian infantry, and Batavian swimmers. The Batavians were especially famed for their ability to fight in rivers, a skill mentioned by Tacitus and supported by inscriptions recording their service. Auxiliary soldiers typically served 25 years, so longer than your normal Roman soldier, and received Roman citizenship upon discharge. This incentive helped bind diverse cultures into the imperial system because of the reward aspect of it. As long as you survived, of course. Auxiliary gear was less standardized than the legionary equipment that we previously mentioned, and as I said, but was still recognizably Roman in design by the early 1st century. Archaeological finds show oval shields for infantry instead of the normal, what we perceive as normal Roman shields, light javelin spears, and the use of local fighting styles. Syrian archers, for example, used composite bows whose remains and arrowheads have been discovered in Germany and the Balkans. Auxiliary cavalry helmets, often more ornate than their legionary versions, appear in finds from Nijmegen to Zenten. These helmets had a characteristic face guard and were mostly used in training or in display events rather than battle, as suggested by the wear patterns on the surviving examples. So obviously they would be fancy, but they're fancy for a reason. They're fancy for show, much like a lot of what we now consider to be parade ground appearances of soldiers. Auxiliaries also gave Rome a tactical flexibility. Light infantry, cavalry, archers, and slingers offset the legion's heavy infantry focus. Their presence allowed the Romans to focus on responding to various terrain and enemy tactics. This combined armed structure is recorded in Caesar's commentaries and supported by deployments seen in later Roman operations. Of course, key to all of this was the logistics and engineering that was needed to not only allow the military to function, but also to travel. Romans' military success depended on more than weapons and soldiers, and this is where this all comes in, because realistically, engineering and logistics was the center of what made this Roman military so dangerous. Throughout the provinces, the remains of Roman military roads show the scale of the engineering effort. Roads linked fortresses cities, and ports. It enabled rapid movement of troops and supplies. In Gaul, the Via Agrippa network, created under Augustus, connected major settlements across the region. Fort construction, as well, was highly standardized. Excavations at Holtern and Nijmegen show rectangular forts with ramparts, ditches, and internal layouts that match descriptions found in Vegetus. The policy of building marching camps every night is confirmed by numerous small temporary camps visible in the aerial photography in Britain or on the continent. Even though these camps belong mostly to later periods, their consistent design reflects long standard practice. Caesar's construction of a Rhine bridge in 55 BCE is sometimes doubted due to its speed, but archaeological remains of Roman bridges, pilings, and other things along the Rhine demonstrate that the Romans regularly built substantial river crossings. Siege work uncovered in Elysia correspond closely to the Caesar's descriptions, including the double ramparts, ditches, and timber palisades, so it makes it more likely, not less likely, that he was accurate in describing how quickly they were able to build things. Roman forts contain workshops known as fabricae, where armorers, carpenters, and smiths repaired equipment. Medical instruments discovered at various sites, including Vindanosia and Carnuntum, show that military medics were trained in surgical procedures, and the survival of hospitals inside early legionary bases confirm that medical care was an organized component of the army. Again, best way to keep your army functional is to keep it healthy, and if you can, be able to heal issues as they come along. And this again goes back to the logistics of it all, because if you can heal broken bones, if you can fix sword cuts and, abuses and abrasions, then you have a chance of keeping that soldier in the fight. And the more experienced soldiers you can keep in a fight, the more likely it is you're going to win. And that's something that would, again, benefit the Romans. And it's something that nobody else in this time period has to the same degree. And you can kind of understand why it gave them such a massive advantage. This support network allowed Rome to maintain armies in the field for long periods, often far from supply bases, and such capacity was essential for the conquest of places like Gaul and would be equally essential during the invasion of Britain, as you would obviously see. By the early 1st century, Rome had no serious rival in the Mediterranean, yet expansion did not stop. Several factors explain why these conquests continued. First, of course, was the military successes legitimized political authority, something that was incredibly important in an unstable time period like the 1st century BCE, where Rome's stability was very much not there. Augustus, for example, used language of restoring peace, but still promoted victories in Spain, Gaul, and the Alps. Claudius, who lacked the military reputation of earlier emperors, had a strong incentive to pursue a successful campaign. The invasion of Britain provided him with an opportunity to demonstrate authority. Rome's political culture rewarded military glory. Triumphs, inscriptions, and public monuments celebrated conquest. This system, of course, encouraged continued expansion and continued conquest. Rome saw frontiers not as fixed lines, but as zones to be shaped. Control of the Alps secured routes into Gaul and Italy. Pushing into the Rhine and Danube regions created buffer zones between hostile groups and the empire's core provinces. Britain was not entirely unknown, of course. Rome had been trading and had extensive contacts in the region. An earlier expedition from Caesar, of course, had revealed its wealth and the presence of tribes with connections to Gaul. From a Roman perspective, bringing Britain into the empire removed a potential source of unrest on the continent. Obviously, the other aspect is we can make ourselves rich on all of the wealth involved as well, which doesn't hurt. Conquered provinces provided taxes, tribute, slaves, and resources. Gaul proved especially valuable. Archaeological evidence shows rapid establishment of urban centers, new roads, and agricultural estates after the conquest. The same logic would later be applied in Britain with its mineral resources such as lead and tin, and of course its resources such as wool that would help to dress the population. Rome's expansion therefore combined political necessity, military strategy, and economic advantage to create a perfect, lasting sense of conquest. The clearest example we have of early imperial military in action comes from the Gallic Wars. Caesar's commentaries are our primary source for this, and although they contain political motivations, archaeology has often supported his general descriptions of these battles and of these people. Caesar frequently remarks on the discipline of his troops, and this is borne out by their battlefield behavior. At the Battle of the Sambre in 57, and I'm sure I've said that wrong, my apologies, the Roman line successfully reorganized under intense pressure. Caesar attributes this to the training and reliability of his soldiers. Excavations in the region show that Rome's fortifications and possible combat areas consistent with the general outline of Caesar's account, although the exact site has remained debated. The siege at Alesia, the most famous demonstration of Roman engineering, with excavations by French archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries and more recent geophysical surveys, have confirmed the existence of siege lines described by Caesar. The double circumvallation system with trenches, stakes, and fortifications reflect the Roman doctrine. It was not an improvisation, but an application of standard military practice. Caesar also made extensive use of cavalry auxiliaries from Gaul and Germany. Their presence is supported by inscriptions from early imperial period and by later formations of cavalry alliae drawn from these communities. Roman forces also included slingers and archers. Sling stones are found in Gallic sites that show widespread use of as a ranged weapon. The structured march of the legionaries, with their temporary camps and their armor, created a powerful impression. Caesar's records that some tribes surrendered upon hearing of the Roman approach, for example, would be something that would be, at the very least, plausible. Archaeology confirms that the density of Roman camps are across Gaul, and these sites show a pattern of methodical movement and establishing of operation areas. Rome's forces did not simply appear. They advanced in a controlled and organized manner, as you would imagine from a very unified and structured force. Along with this, unified command and strategy remained paramount. Caesar's campaigns benefited from a clear chain of command. Tribal coalitions in Gaul sometimes struggled to coordinate strategies and had different priorities. Even Vercingetorix faced challenges in maintaining unity. Roman political and military structures gave their forces cohesion that their opponents often lacked. This does not diminish Gallic resistance, which was fierce at times and highly effective, but it does highlight a key advantage held by Rome when fighting, and something we'll see in Britain. Everything discussed so far provides a foundation for the army that would eventually invade Britain. Although Caesar crossed the Channel and almost a century earlier, those expeditions were, as we've mentioned before, very temporary. The Claudian invasion, however, was a major military operation requiring substantial preparation. Rome developed multiple legions for the invasion, and historical sources name the 2nd Legion Augusta and the 4th Legion Gemina and the 12th Legion Valera Victrix, as well as the 9th Legion Hispania, that also appeared to be associated with the invasion force based on later deployments in the provinces. While scholars debate on the precise composition, these 4 legions are strongly supported by inscriptions and early military activity in Britain. Each legion brought its own cohorts of specialists, engineers, and support staff. Thousands of auxiliary troops provided cavalry and light infantry. The scale of the operation fits with the Roman method used during large campaigns elsewhere. I must admit, though, that when we talk about the numbers of legion in the legions, we have to admit that those are what one would describe as the perfect example. Not every legion was this many men strong with that many men in each century. It didn't always work like that. Sometimes the numbers didn't match what was being said. And frequently, of course, if those legions are fighting elsewhere, they're going to lose troops, but they may not have replaced them yet. So you may have gaps in the line comparatively from what is described in the sources, and the sources are not to be trusted on numbers at times. Transporting an army across the sea channel, of course, was not a trivial task. Rome had already demonstrated naval capacity in the Mediterranean, and during the earlier expedition of Caesar to Britain by the 40s AD, the Roman Navy had permanent fleets stationed in the north of Gaul. The Classis Germanica on the Rhine and the Classis Britannica were responsible for transport and supply. Archaeological evidence of Roman shipbuilding on the Rhine region show vessels capable of carrying soldiers, horses, and equipment. Invasion fleets likely consisted of hundreds of transport ships and support vessels. Once ashore, the army immediately built fortifications and temporary marching camps, and the earliest fort sites in Britain, though slightly later in date, reflect standard Roman construction practices consistent with what we see in Gaul and in Germany. Roman commanders in the invasion force were familiar with tribal societies, having served in Gaul and Germany. Tactics used in these regions prepared the army for a diverse terrain and a dispersed tribal power structures like they had in Britain. This institutional memory was one of Rome's hidden advantages. Individual soldiers might rotate out, but the legion, as an institution, carried decades of accumulated operations knowledge. To understand why this army could operate so effectively, we must consider how Rome saw warfare. For Rome, war was a normal part of governance. The Roman Senate and later the emperor directed military campaigns as a routine aspect of maintaining the state. Inscriptions and triumphal monuments and public ceremonies all celebrated military success. This cultural environment ensured that the army received the resources, political attention, and high social regard needed to continue its domination of society. Training regimens are described by Vegetus, although writing several centuries later, these practices appear to have been consistent with earlier periods. Soldiers drilled with wooden swords heavier than actual weapons, ran long distances in full kit, and trained in formations. Archaeological evidence of training grounds and practice weapons from the continental forts support the idea that training was constant and consistent. Discipline was strict. Punishment for desertion or mutiny were severe. The centurion maintained order within the ranks. The survival of numerous tombstones for centurions across the empire reflects the status and authority of these officers. Roman armies could fight pitched battles, conduct sieges, and build roads, and operate in forests, crossing rivers, and hold garrison posts. This adaptability was essential for operating in diverse regions, from the deserts of North Africa to the dusty and desert-like areas of West Asia, to places like the forests and mountains of Europe, in the Alps and other regions, and into Britain across what they considered to be the ocean. Rome's willingness to adopt equipment and tactics from the auxiliaries, such as the Germanic cavalry or the Syrian archers, shows a pragmatic approach as well that would go very well in their battles. By the year 43 AD, Rome possessed a military machine unmatched in its preparation, structure, and experience. The early imperial army combined professional heavy infantry, specialist auxiliary forces, a standardized engineering and logistical system, and a clear command hierarchy. The archaeology supports this picture, from the fortresses at Mainz and Nijmegen to the armor found at Calcarees and Corbridge. We have a substantial record of the equipment and what was used by the earliest imperial troops. From cemeteries, inscriptions, we know of the origins of the roles of both legionaries and auxiliaries. From temporary camps and siege works, we see the methodical nature of Roman campaigning. Rome continued to conquer because of its political system rewarding military success, because strategic frontiers demanded expansion, and because provinces brought such economic wealth. The conquest of Gaul demonstrates how these factors combined. The defeat of tribal coalitions, the rapid construction of siege lines, and the disciplined maneuvers of the legions all demonstrated what made the Roman army so formidable. All of this prepared the Roman army for the invasion of Britain. The army that sailed under Claudius was not an improvised force. It was a product of centuries of development and refinement. It was an institution that had learned to win through preparation. Victoria, Paratur. The victory is prepared. And of course, as we go forward, we're going to continue to look at what was happening with the British people, but also we will look more into the politics that was creating this reason to invade Britain. And we're going to go in depth a little bit on that in the next episode. So for now, thank you all for listening or viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach out to me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can go to most social media sites at Welsh History Pod, Facebook being the one exception at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you'd like to help out this podcast to continue to do the research it needs to do, you can do so via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.